Alright guys, back with another video, and in this video I'm going to cover a Ruy Lopez game that was played between Karpov and Korchnoi in the World Championship in 1978. And I chose this game because really it's the most crystal clear example of an open Ruy Lopez that you could ever see. So let's just get into it. It starts with e4, e5, knight to f3, obviously you know these moves, bishop to b5, and then a6 chasing the bishop back. So from here, we see knight to f6, hitting the e4 pawn, castles, and then he takes the pawn. So what's interesting about this game is that Karpov basically plays very, very simple moves, and it almost looks like he makes no mistakes in this game, and according to the computer, there were no mistakes, but it's hard to see where exactly he did something amazing in this game. He just played solid moves, and he ended up beating Korchnoi in a rather simple fashion. So let's see what happens. We see d4, obviously trying to undermine that e5 pawn, open the e-file, and just open the game as much as he can because black decided to accept material, delay his development, and you really want to push as hard as you can in those kind of situations as white. b5, chasing the bishop back, and then after d5, he takes the pawn, getting equal material again, and then bishop to e6, protecting this rather weak d5 pawn. Now from this position, it deviates somewhat from that game that I analyzed previously, and that Karpov, instead of trying to rather quickly just kind of open the position with a4, he really has a clear plan just to develop his queenside pieces. So we see knight out. Now the one drawback of this move is that we see knight to c5, where he can really just trade off this active bishop, and if he does that, then white has a rather slow development, and it's not bad, but it's just solid. So he does play c3, which would have been the other move instead of bringing the knight out first, allowing the bishop to come back. And then we see g6. So obviously he wants to fianchet out that bishop and put pressure on the e5 pawn. The queen comes up. Now, another variation would have been to bring the bishop back and just keep it, although it's a little passive. So he plays queen to e2, bishop out, and then we see knight to d4. All right, so obviously it looks like he's sacking a pawn, but for very good reason. Now another solid variation would have been to play something like rook to e1, bring the knight in, but that's a little slow, and I'll show you what happens if he does that. So he plays something like rook to e1, and then castles. And the main drawback, although it's quite subtle, is that if he does that, then obviously he's not as well developed. But after bishop to g4, he starts undermining this e5 pawn. And after bishop to f4, it looks like he's developing, takes. But after f6, it's actually black who has the initiative. He's going to be opening this f-file, putting pressure on the f3 knight. And as you can see, this knight still is not developed to the ideal square. So he doesn't go for that variation. Instead, he played knight to d4. Now, obviously, this is the open variation, so what does white want to do? He wants to open the game as quickly as possible. Obviously, he doesn't want to take here, and obviously this knight is not defended. So objectively, black should play something like here and not really let white open the game. But he does play knight takes e5. We see f4, which is the logical follow-up, because now black is not castled. He has this, I guess, rather weak bishop sitting there. And now it's actually white who has the initiative. So you can see that the computer is recommending to go here. Korchnoi actually goes here. So if he does play knight from e to d3, then we see something like f5, pawn takes, and now the structure around his king is slightly weakened, and he really doesn't want to castle queenside. So we would have seen takes, and he could have castled, but after this and the bishop back, then you can see that it's really white who has the initiative, and black has a rather weak king, and he's going to get these pieces out. So the knight probably would take, but it's really white who has the advantage in this position. So let's go back. Instead, we see Korchnoi play knight to c4. We still see f5. Knight takes, hitting that bishop. The rook protects it, and then he just takes that knight. Now, objectively, black and white are rather equal in this position, but it's quite hard to play practically in this position because black's king is sitting in the center, he's not as well developed, and he has a lot of weaknesses. So after the knight comes in, we see white try to trade a defender of the king side, and it looks like objectively black should have taken, but he brings back because logically he wants to keep a defender of his king. And after rook in, you can see that white is fully developed. So he has both of the rooks connected, aiming towards the queen and the king, and he also has all of his minor pieces developed facing towards the king. So after the queen comes in, takes, rook takes, hitting the queen, he goes back, and then Karpov decides to trade one of the last defenders of the black king. Check. Now there is an interesting thing where he could bring the bishop in, but it doesn't really change the position much, so we won't look at that. But after the king moves over, he takes, and then playing queen to f3, hitting this undefended rook over here. So keep that in mind. Now, it looks at this point that white actually has a winning advantage because even if this rook, which he has to move it or defend it somehow, it gives white just enough time to get all of his pieces in play. So basically, let's count here. We see white facing towards the king, and with this rook out of play, it's essentially two rooks and a minor piece and queen versus one rook, a minor piece, and a queen on the black side with this exposed king. So that's objectively the activity situation that black is facing. So after the rook comes over, doesn't really do much there, he hits the rook, and I'd like you to evaluate this situation. Again, from the activity standpoint, we see that white is trying to hit this f7 pawn. It does look defended, but there's a very tricky move to see, and maybe it's easy for you at this point. So we see rook to d7, adding a final attacker, and if you can see it, if the bishop takes, then we see a checkmate in 2, right there. So he really should play something like here, but he'd lose a bunch of material and that would be lost anyway. Korchnoi doesn't defend as accurately as he should, going the rook back. And then there's one more trick move that he could play, knight takes. Now, if the bishop takes, then there's all kinds of problems. If the rook takes, then it works either way, and there will be a checkmate or a huge loss of material. But actually the bishop does take, and then we see the final move, which is a little hard to calculate, check. It's a discovered check, so anywhere that the king moves, we would see queen to f8 checkmate, which is a huge problem for black in this situation. Instead, we see he goes here, like that. But actually, if he played bishop here, then we have some cool lines. Takes, check, and then he actually wouldn't just take that rook, but he would check here rather. And there's no moves here because the knight is covering it. And he has to go here. Well, he has to give up his queen, which would be terrible, so he'd lose a bunch of material. But if he tries to go here and escape, then it's actually a checkmate because the knight is covering that final square. So a very interesting game overall. And if you have any questions regarding any of the lines or any of the tactics, leave it in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.